Hey, good people. February is Black History Month, and I'm celebrating it by hosting a special event that I want to share with all of you. On Wednesday, February 17th, join me at 7 p.m. Eastern Time for Unblocking Our Blessing, a 75-minute virtual event on how we cultivate the sexiness we need to thrive on this planet in the months and years ahead. During this brief yet powerful and interactive webinar, I'll share my insight on what sexiness really is and why it's nothing to fear. I'll also provide you with concrete strategies for how to get that good kind of energy successfully flowing in all areas of your life. Towards the end of the session, I'll also provide you with info on how you can tap into my upcoming BSE Sex Ed Intensive set to begin later on this spring. Tickets for Unblocking Our Blessing are $20 and can be found under the Events tab on the T.S.O.B website. This event is open to everyone. However, in particular, no person of African descent will be turned away for inability to pay. There will also be closed captioning, and a recording will be provided for those who cannot attend live. For more info or specific questions, shoot us an email at mailbox@tsobpodcast.com. Now, let's start the show. Welcome to T.S.O.B with Dr. G, a podcast featuring intellectual table talk about race and sexuality. I'm your host, Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert, a sexuality educator, writer, and researcher. Join me as I talk with the most brilliant minds in human sexuality, applying a professional Black lens to discussions about sexiness, health, and healing in the new millennium. It's T.S.O.B, the sex ed of Black folk. Let's get to the get down, shall we? Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to another episode of TSOB with Dr. G. I'm Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert, and I am over the moon excited to be with you for another episode. I have the pleasure of having one of my again, I say this with all the episodes, but it's true. Like one of my most favorite people on the planet to have this conversation with me today. I am super excited because she brings in a variety of different avenues in this conversation, specifically sex ed through the lens of public health, and also being a person at an HBCU, an alum of an HBCU, a historically Black college. So I'm very excited to introduce you all and reintroduce you all to, for those who know her already, to the Southern Sexologist, aka Tanya M. Bass. Tanya M. Bass is a national award-winning sexuality educator and a subject matter expert in the areas of health equity and sexual health. She is an alumna of North Carolina Central University's Department of Public Health Education, where she has served as an adjunct instructor for the past 10 years. Currently, Tanya is the lead instructor for human sexuality. Tanya is a highly requested trainer, facilitator, and mentor. Much of her work has been in collaboration with community-based organizations, churches, academic institutions, and state and national conferences. She is a past co-chair for the 2014 National Sex Ed Conference and the 2020 American Association of Sexuality Educators, Counselors, and Therapists Conference. She also has her own conference, the NC Sex Ed Con, which hopefully she'll talk a little bit about while we're talking today. Tanya is also a current member of the editorial board for the American Journal of Sexuality Education. But let me stop talking and go ahead and welcome Tanya Bass to the floor. Hi, Tanya. Hey, girl.
Hi, Dr. Tracy, Dr. G.
How are you?
I am great. I'm hanging in there as best we can during these times.
Listen, and the reality is that it is going to be what it is. And, you know, Black femmes aren't immune to hard times. And so we rolling, we striving. And you are giving us glory. I'm loving this crown you're giving us, this head wrap you're giving us. The folks, I have to admit, I haven't yet gotten the video together on YouTube, but I will just say on YouTube, if the video is up, you see this. If not, you just hear my voice. But for the folks listening, you don't get to witness this glory, but you can go to YouTube and subscribe and you can view the glory. Anywho, Thank you so much, Tanya, for joining me. I'm not going to waste too much more time. I just really want to jump right in because I know you have a lot of amazing things to say that the people love to hear. Tell me, let's go ahead and start off with the question I ask all of my interviewees: where you're from, where your people from, and what's got you thinking about sex ed or sex these days?
Yeah, so I have to first acknowledge my people are from Eastern North Carolina, Beaufort County, the city of Pantego. That's where my family origin starts. But I am from Brooklyn, New York. So my mother, I don't use the word migrated, but I guess transitioned to Brooklyn, New York at age, I think, 13 or 14, and then has lived there and still lives in the exact same apartment that I grew up in, was born in all these years ago. But I actually did the reverse of what she did when I was 13, and I moved to North Carolina with my grandmother. And I want to be clear because there's always a narrative, and I don't want nobody to put a story on mine that my mother let me make that choice based on my decision to I liked the South. Like, I didn't know it was North Carolina. My mother could certainly take care of me and was able to. She didn't even think I was going to stay, but it wasn't because she couldn't care for me. She just was a person who I think now more than ever allowed me to make my own decision. So I'm from Bed-Stuy, but by way of Pantego, North
Stop.
Carolina.
Boogie, wait. As a Midwesterner, I'm not gonna pretend like I know any of the lingo in New York. I was about to say boogie down, but then I was like, wait, that's Bronx. Never mind.
Oh, that's Bronx.
Never mind.
I'm a Brooklyn queen. I'm a Brooklyn queen.
So you came down to North Carolina and you've been there ever since?
Ever since, like, we used to come every summer, and I just love running around playing with my cousins. And so when my grandmother said, I'm retiring, I've raised my kids, I'm not taking anybody with me, I was like, I'm going. Sassy, I'm going. And she was like, no, you're not. So it was the summer when she moved, and I was like, I'm staying. And I stayed. And then when I hit puberty, I was kind of like, well, I need to get out of here, but it was too late.
But I'm here now.
Yeah, there was like, it's a good idea that you're there, actually. Yeah. So yeah, it worked out.
Beautiful, beautiful. I love that. And I think migration is probably the term, right? Thinking of the Great Migration and just the different patterns that Black folks have taken over our course of history. I think too, what you said, the reverse is kind of the bigger trend now of like Black folks who grew up in the North who've moved back down to the South and are trying to make their way in different areas. And I know North Carolina is a big hub of folks doing that. We're not going to get into that, but I'm just thinking about that in the moment. So great. So tell me, okay, we got to Beaufort County, right?
Beaufort.
Beaufort. Let me clarify. Beaufort County. How'd you get from there into sex ed?
Wow. So from Beaufort County, like, I just think about my life experience for sure, being raised there. Like, I literally, if you've ever seen people walk to church or you see a group of Black folks walking to church, like, that was us. Because my home with my grandmother, where she lived, where we lived, like, our church was right across the street. So, like, we could go and play on the church property at any point, just randomly doing stuff. So I think about my upbringing and some of the lessons I did get and some of the ones I didn't get. And it's a rural town. And so when I went to North Carolina Central University, I had my heart set on being a nurse. And the way the curriculum was structured and the way I was advised and took my classes, it would have been that I had one class to keep me from applying for the upper division of nursing. And that would have required me to either find additional classes randomly to pay for or move off campus because, you can't take one credit and live on the yard. And I was just like, well, this is a crisis. I got to graduate.
Right.
And so I got advised to change my major to public health. And once I started there, it was like in the early 90s. And so HIV was being more and more discussed. And by the time I made that decision, I knew that I wanted to do some kind of, like, I wanted to be the STD police because that's what we called it. I wanted to go out, and now I know the proper name is disease intervention specialist, which is so common now because people are talking about contact tracing. But yeah, I knew I wanted to do that. And so I kind of found my way by changing my major to public health.
Wow. That's so funny because I guess maybe you could speak to this too. It feels so resonant to me. Like I'm very adamant, and we'll get into in a minute why I'm very adamant about not coming through to sex ed from public health, but it's all what's resonating for me about your story is the whole idea of you just kind of stumbled into it, right? It wasn't something that you just decided when you were like 13, 14, 15, I'm going to be a sex educator. Like, I didn't even know that was a thing that people, like a
Right.
formal profession that people did until maybe I was 20. Like, I think I was in my early 20s and I was working with a youth group, and we had we invited Planned Parenthood to come in and present. And it was like, this is a thing? Like, and I'm
Right.
looking at this person. This is no shade to Planned Parenthood, but I was like, and you doing it like this? I could have been did this.
Right?
So it's just interesting to me, and I wonder. Sometimes I'm curious about how that is affected by race, and how many Black folks are like, yeah, I never would have thought I would be in sex ed, but here I am, and I'm loving the work.
Yeah, well, I think for me, because that was my experience, and I realized that what I just shared, like, even the process of NCCU, you know, bless them, right? That's my university, that's my alma mater, that's where I work right now. But the nursing department has produced a lot of public health majors for various reasons. We'll leave it at that. And the benefit, although I know we have work to do in our department, and that's where I come in now, but that definitely was the transition where people changed their major from nursing for whatever reason, and then when they got to public health, whether it's myself, whether it's my colleague who's retired, Dr. David Jolly, Dr. Laverne Reed, a couple of other folks who either connected them with folks who were working in the profession or whatever, that's how their interest in working in sexuality happened. So it wasn't the worst thing in a sense, but we know that prevention kind of gives you kind of like all the ugly dark parts, I feel like, of sexuality, and doesn't highlight the positive aspects. And I know that's my experience, and so now I try not to make it the experience of others.
Oh, yeah.
And help them dig into, like, why do you want to do this? Because maybe you don't exactly want to do sex ed, maybe you want to do perinatal education, or something around maternal and child health. Although it's sexuality related, it's not specifically honing in sex.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And you know what, you brought up some things that I think we're going to get into in a minute, but I'd like to uplift the fact that you are doing this work currently now at an HBCU, and that there was such a strong emphasis on this class and human sexuality, and helping folks in public health understand human sexuality, particularly. I don't know, and maybe you can speak to this too, but I think about my experiences as an alum of an HBCU, Go Big Blue, Tennessee State University, class of 2000. And this whole, the culture of HBCUs are such that my experience has been that sexuality is just not something that people just feel free to talk about, to teach on, to have different conversations. I mean, I did have a health class, and I think that was the first time I learned about, that was the first time I even learned about orgasms, but it was heavily, here's an STI, here is how it will kill you, and this is what you need to protect yourself from. So to hear that there's a whole class in the HBCU that really goes more in depth into the normative lived experience of sexuality, I'm super excited about. Can you talk a little bit more about what that's been like at North Carolina Central?
Ooh, I feel like I'm getting teary-eyed just thinking about it, because I want to turn, like, I don't know how much you can see, Tracy, of my background, but, like, can you see the word sex education or sexuality education?
I think it's blinded by your window, but I'm going to, oh, right there. I see it. Yes, with the white and black.
Right here. So, and there's this woman here. This is Miss Mildred Page. Miss Mildred Page taught sexuality education at NCCU, I don't know how many years. Like, I'll at least say, I want to say 50. I don't know. She retired. I believe she was 82 when she retired. And the reason why we're hugging right there is she was giving me her class.
Wow.
The blessing to teach her class.
Wow.
So there were, she was the main sexuality teacher there. And then a couple of other folks taught it as well. But that was like the class that people wanted to take. Like, they loved Miss Page. They loved her approach. I used to agree when people were like, oh, she was like the black Dr. Ruth. No, she's more of the June Butts. Now that I know who Dr.
Yes,
June Butts
right?
is, that's the Dr. June Butts of
Yes. And can you,
NCCU.
for the folks who don't know, who are like, who the hell is June Butts? Can you clarify who that is?
Yeah, June Butts is one of the first pioneers, black women in sexuality education. I know, much love to Dr. Jocelyn Elders, but there was also June Butts who actually taught at HBCUs, who worked with the CDC, who actually had a column in Essence magazine. So she was all about black sexuality. We just hadn't heard about her during our time. And so I praise Dr. Butts now because I'm like, I know her. Like I
Yes.
feel like I know the spirit of her. She recently passed away, but yeah, pretty dope. And so Miss Page was that mainstay in the health ed department. And then as we started growing, like I was talking about HIV/AIDS, one of my colleagues started working with creating a peer education program and reached out, and so we jointly worked on that. Like he started it, and we helped build the program where we were training our students on learning about sexuality. Although it was focused on prevention, we still had those deep conversations, and even conversations, because being a peer educator doesn't mean that you're not having sex, doesn't mean you always wear a condom.
Listen.
Like you're just
Listen.
trying to transfer the information and letting them know that there's a level of responsibility that you have, but we also know that you're human. And so bridging all of that together. So I would say, even with its challenges, NCCU has been at the forefront of a lot of sexuality education in North Carolina, but it doesn't mean we're also the best at what we're doing either.
Yeah.
We still have the challenges of an HBCU. We are one of 5 HBCUs. I think a sixth one just joined at the other school in North Carolina, North Carolina A&T. But to have an LGBT center.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so, I think we're doing the work as best we can, but I know that we're fighting against a lot of respectability politics, a lot of old history, a lot of different worldviews, colliding, and we're trying to expand them so that our students feel safe, loved, and supported.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's so important, because I think about not only the level of ignorance, but the level of just downright harm that was caused,
Yes.
that I think gets caused through silence, through acting as if things aren't the way they are, or being downright antagonizing, particularly to LGBTQ students. Like I remember
Absolutely.
just the outright, and of course, a lot of this, and this is not to shame at all, but a lot of this is connected to religion and being in the Bible Belt, and kind of this idea, like I was telling you, I was like, sex ed for us was soul ties. Like it was this health class about STIs, and it was soul ties. And I think that was easy for some of us, but for those for whom that wasn't a frame of reference, or that wasn't something that was resonant enough to really be ingrained, that was a challenge to be able to navigate. Okay, so what does it have to do with the actual sex that I am having right now? Right? Like, yes. Okay.
And it's so troubling, because it wasn't until a few of my students became my colleagues, we've had conversations about some of the harm, some of the homophobia, the transphobia that, I always felt like, if there's going to be a safe place at NCCU, it's going to be in the Department of Public Health Education.
Yeah.
But maybe 2 or 3 years ago, I had a conversation with 2 queer and trans students at that I consider colleagues now, and when they shared with me the fear, the stigma, the intimidation, and the harm, and even the assumptions. I'm using the word assumptions because I feel like people presume things or assume things about their students based on what they think they see and
Oh,
they
absolutely.
know. And then they say things that are harmful. And so hearing that, it broke my heart, knowing that my colleagues could be this way to students, when I'm thinking, we're all on the same page,
Right.
about being inclusive, being supportive, and making our classroom safe.
Right.
And so we weren't a safe haven for our
Right.
students.
And to be clear, this sexuality thing is something we all need to work out. Like, let's not act like just because you don't have a label that you ain't got some queerness that you need to reconcile in yourself and a few other things, right?
Right.
So I thank you, I'll say, as a former HBCU student, thank you for doing that hard work, that good work. So let's shift a little bit and talk about the public health more broadly, more generally, thinking about that. So one of the things I've not said, but I'll just share now, is that public health has a big place in the sex ed trajectory of Black folks in terms of our history, in terms of how we're even exposed to sex ed. And a lot of it has to do with prevention, like you were saying. And I big up Linwood Lewis, who, once I read his article, I'm not even sure what else he's done, but when I read his article about preventive versus eudaimonic lenses and how that affects sex ed, I was like, bingo, eureka. And so to break that down for folks, it's this idea of how we teach sex ed, whether or not we're teaching it from this framework where sexuality is a normative lived experience where everybody's experiencing it. And so our goal is to help people experience wellness in their sexual expression, in their relationships, healthy relationships, and all those things, or whether or not we teach through the preventive lens, which is all about sex is bad, it will kill you, protect yourself or die, right? And far too often, Black folks have received that negative lens, that preventive lens, and unfortunately, public health has had a big role to do with that, such that now there's this awesome phrase that I hope you get into, where that you'll discuss, that where we're acknowledging that racism is a public health issue, right? And so, can you share a little bit about? I mean, you could talk historically if you want to. You can talk present day, just a little bit about how race has informed the public health discussion about sex ed, and what's the work that educators like yourself what's the work that you're doing to push back against that narrative?
Yeah, I think race and racism are definitely, guiding the thoughts and the conversations around public health and, in particular, sexuality and sex ed. When I think about, I've been reading Killing the Black Body, and, hearing about Black, and oftentimes I don't say sexuality field. I'll try to say the profession, because field triggers me in a way, and I'm using the word loosely, trigger, but it just makes me think deeper about what that looks like. So one, knowing that during the time when Margaret Sanger had the Negro Project, they were utilizing what I consider community-based sexuality educators, Black folks, that they could educate and teach to go talk to other Black folks, which in essence, in theory, in and of itself, is not harmful. However, and though, we know what that looked like for the Negro Project around eugenics and etc. And even using the Black church, like people think it's so novel, like, oh, we should use the Black church as such a pillar in a way, like they were doing it then. W.E.B. Du Bois was one of the ones who signed on to this project coming to the South. So I think about how race played a part in that, and like how we've actually, what we've been taught and what we think about ourselves. And then if I move it fast forward, I think about the ways in which, so I do a lot of work now too with maternal and child health, and the story with Serena Williams and being in the hospital and not being taken seriously, or that mindset of bias where Black women can take more pain, or something like that. If she hadn't advocated for herself, and she didn't have to holler, in a sense, even being Serena Williams, that no, this is a problem, I need to get this CAT scan done. Ultimately, she probably could have died after giving birth. And we look at what's happening with maternal mortality for Black folks or Black women already. And it's just amazing to me. So I think that we not only get those hypersexive sexual messages of like, you're having so much sex, and if you do this, whatever, from that prevention. I don't think we talk about pleasure enough. I know I was trained, and I'm going to own it, because I've been delivered from the whole,
Amen.
Just put a condom on and use lube, it feels the same.
Amen.
Like, I was literally lying to people and didn't own that I was lying, didn't realize, and sometimes that I was lying.
Yes.
And I was like, I am lying, because I know for myself, put in with a condom, and you can put on as much lube as you want, it's still not going to feel.
It's not going to feel the same.
Like,
it doesn't.
Not using a condom. So, but what I realized what we needed to do was, like, we never talked about the types of condoms. And even when I started out, we only had primarily the two, which was lambskin and, latex. But now we have polyisoprene, polyurethane. And so the conversations need to go deeper than put some lube on.
Oh, absolutely.
And it's almost dismissive. Like, you don't need to enjoy it. Just Put some lube on. Make sure you use it. And that was I was very robotic in even my prevention because I literally regurgitated the messages that I was hearing from the CDC or from public health leaders and telling my folks that and not really getting to know like there's a reason why you're not using condoms. There's a reason why you can't have a conversation with your partner about having syphilis. So I think the way our blackness shows up in that is that it's just, well, if you're gonna have sex, you better have it this way. And I don't really care if you like it. Just don't be spreading disease.
Yeah.
That's what it felt like.
Yeah. And I think that's so important because what you said, that, and I think this is a contemporary conversation when we talk about racial justice and sex ed spaces. So many people think it's just about putting black and brown faces at the table. And it's like, if the black and brown faces are continually perpetuating white supremacist ideals or anti-black ideals about how sex goes, then it doesn't matter what the color of their skin is. It's not just about the access to resources and access to job opportunities. It's like, okay, yeah, this person is the head of the public health department, but if they have a attitude that's like, oh, these niggas gonna be out here doing whatever, and it's my job to stop that, like, they're not helpful. It's not helpful. And so I'm glad you raised that point because another one, at some point I'm going to get him on this show, another one of your public health colleagues, Javante Williams. We often get into these back and forths because I'm like, forget public health. That's why the problem is we got now because y'all out here perpetuating. And he has to be like, Tracy, it's not all of us. We get it. But it's like, but I think it's important that those who come through public health in particular have those critical conversations about where's the balance between preventing adverse outcomes that we don't want people to experience, but in the end, stopping people from living their authentic sexual lives. Because I think the balance has to be struck, especially for Black folks who haven't, as a collective, been given that opportunity.
No, I think you're absolutely right because when I do think about, even when I think about spaces that I've gone in on, so, going to the American Public Health Association conference or the American College Health, like the ideas around sex are like so different than when you go to an actual sexuality conference and looking around, you're like, well, where y'all been? That's how I felt when I first went to one. And I was like, okay. But then I was like, so why aren't my colleagues from health here, like why aren't we married together? And then when I started inviting people or telling them about it, they were like, wait, what? So it's almost like you are siloed intentionally and no one's crossing over. And right now, like maybe 2 years ago, there was just an article coming out about prevention being more sex positive. Well, hallelujah, like finally,
right.
Like we've been trying to tell y'all this for years. And then when I think about administratively, because I wanted to come back to the field workers term, administratively, how race shows up there or racialization is that although I think it's important that people working in the community look like the community, I think it's very interesting. Certain organizations, and even in my state experience, the people who were considered field workers were the disease intervention specialists who were going out in the community. They literally called us the field office. And while that had been going on for years, no one thought about the connotation until I started talking about it. And I still don't know. I want to say they changed it. I probably need to Google that and go on our page and look to see. But they might have changed it, but it was called field services, literally field services. And while I think they meant the field,
of course,
I still feel like there was an undertone because most of those people were Black and brown.
Yeah, and most of us, when you look across organizations, right, and we're not going to belabor the point too much because I really want to get into, but I think for our colleagues who might be listening, it is a critical conversation to think about that by and large, when you look at the structure of organizations that do sex ed, you'll find that the folks at the top who organize the work, who coordinate the work, who determine what the priorities are, they tend to be white. And the folks who are carrying out those orders, and a lot of it is not, it's not forced because a lot of us get into this work because we have the passion of doing direct service, because we have the desire to be with people. But it still kind of shakes out that we are carrying out white folks' orders with the Black folks. And so we're the ones on the ground. And so when you said it, I was like, I didn't even think about that. I may not ever use the term field again because I didn't even think about it until you just broke it down. Like, oh shoot. But
I try not to because it's so much in our vernacular. But like, I'll try to like profession, because
yeah.
it just for me.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it. And I'm listen, it ain't nothing for me to change a term. Look. But anywho, let's get into Southern sexologists because we know well, I know this is
Yes.
your brand. This is your energy to the world. I love the term. Tell the folks what you feel like your sex ed superpower is.
I would think in some ways connection is my sex ed superpower, and the reason I say that is so like you hear my story of being from Brooklyn and then living the remaining part of my life all of, since then in North Carolina. And it even took me a while to like some people who knew me from Brooklyn or know that I'm from there were like, well, you're not Southern, why do you want to be the Southern sexologist? Or Southern, you want to be Southern, like
Mm,
you know what that means. And I was like, you know what, I definitely embrace some of the positive aspects of being a Southern person, but
mm-hmm.
I'm holding on. Nuck if you buck, I'm still Brooklyn,
Right.
but at the same time, I think it's connection because I've had even at a young age that lived experience
Mm-hmm.
of understanding diversity and understanding like people are just people, they're individuals, and there's certain things around our culture. It was a culture shock moving here and trying to connect with even in junior high school. Whew, let me tell you, if you don't know how to connect and make your own space,
Mm-hmm.
you could be devoured by all the things. And I couldn't imagine doing that, even now with social media and all of that stuff. But yeah, I think the ability to go into a space and connect with individuals and understanding that I'm not going to connect with everybody, and that's
Mm-hmm.
cool too. But that's my goal, is like, if nothing else, if you don't learn something new from me, at least we've connected on a level. So I think that's why I landed with
Yeah.
connection.
And I think that's a good one for you because I think about what popped in my head was like everybody knows Tanya Bass, like everybody, right? And that I think that's true. I love what you bring up though about kind of the north south kind of thing that happens because one of the things that I feel like as Black folks that is true at least up into through maybe the Xennial older millennial generation is the connection between the north and the south, every single one of
Mm-hmm.
us. And that's why I asked the question of like, where are you from, where are your people from, because each and every one of us has that story of like, well, I'm from here but my people are from. And I think it's important to keep that connection and acknowledge that we have roots, especially when we talk about from a
Mm,
diasporan conversation around, folks, oh, Black Americans don't have culture. They don't have, excuse you, we have a whole root. We have
right.
whole histories. And I think even a lot of Black Americans, because for a variety of other reasons that are fall outside this episode's topic, we want to kind of deny that, or we want to kind of poo-poo that, or we kind of want to disregard that. But it's like,
Mm-hmm.
no, those roots matter. Our country cousins matter. And especially when we look at our culture and the fact that the South
Yes.
is so influential on a general level, it's like, how dare you act like you ain't got no connection? Like, how you dare you ain't got no, how you act like you ain't got no roots? Like,
Right.
absolutely. So I think that's an awesome term to think about. Absolutely. Absolutely. So when you think about sex ed, the ways that you have seen it show up in Black and brown, well, Black communities, but Black and brown, we can throw Black and brown in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is there one, if there's any one thing that you feel like when you're with a Black audience and you're talking about sex ed, what's one thing that you feel like, you know what, we may need to tighten this up a little bit in terms of how we're understanding these topics, in terms of how we're embracing these topics? What might be one thing that you feel like, you know what, Black folks, we need to do better around this as it relates to sexuality?
I feel like Black folks, we need to do better around, like, I'm just gonna say yucking people's yums. Like, not being, I don't even wanna say accepting, but just letting people do their thing. Like, maybe it's judgmental, like
Mm-hmm.
not being judgmental. Like, we will be like, ooh, somebody's a freak, a hoe, they nasty,
Mm-hmm.
all of that. And it's kind of like, can we just let people live? If you don't like to do it, you don't have to do it. Like, nobody's
Nobody
making
asked you
you
to do it.
lick toes or booty holes or anything. But if somebody else wants to, rock
Rock
on. Like,
on.
just mind your business. And I think we have so much about like trying, I don't know if we want to control our peers or we just want to judge them, or maybe we just need to deal with some stuff in ourselves. Like, I would try it, but I
Mm-hmm.
don't
Mm-hmm.
know. But it just feels like we have to do better in like teaching people that there's more to life than missionary style,
Yeah.
and that there's so many things you could try, but you don't have to if you don't want to.
Yeah.
And if you try it and don't like it, that's okay too.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so glad you brought that up because the thing that I was like, every time I ask a question, I'm like, I always have my own ideas in my own head, but I appreciate you saying that because I think about what you said earlier about respectability politics. And
Mm-hmm.
and I
Mm-hmm.
also think about how much the reliance on Black people being a monolith is part of that discussion as well, right? Like I think
Right.
about how many times I've heard a Black person say about something, "Oh, that's white people shit." Right? That's not something we
Right.
do. When it's like, first off, do you know all the Black people? Second off, how has how do you know that it's not something that has been a part because our culture has been so colonized over for so long and completely, that's a whole other deep discussion. How do you know these aren't things that were a part of us that have been stolen or that have been co-opted or
Right.
that have been damaged in our process of coming to this planet or coming to this through this country, not planet, country. And then finally, how much of that even matters to who you are as an individual person? Like, is someone coming to look into your bedroom? Is somebody like, do you have to give a report of what you did in your bedroom? Like, why is there this need to self police or other police based on things that you technically, unless you weren't involved, weren't gonna
A part of.
actually be part of or be privy to?
Right.
So I think about that a lot, particularly within the context of race and this idea of what the ideal Black sexual person is doing.
I don't know. I We have so much work to do to figure out like where did this come from? Why is it happening? And how do we stop it? But I love that you brought it back to those respectability politics because this goes like, a so and such would never do that, or whatever. So
And it's like, what
yeah,
well,
I
what if
think
they did? Like, what if they did? I mean, I think about I just think about a lot of different things. And I think about how, going back to what you said about pleasure, how much pleasure has been taken from us. And not to say that we don't
ooh,
have it, because I also believe, like I said, I've said at the beginning of this show when I first started it, that Black folks lead the way in terms of articulating what pleasure can look like. Like, I think our culture sets the standard for
speaks
the
it right.
possibilities. So it's amazing to me how there's this both and that exists between like sex positivity. We know how to articulate it, and
Yep.
yet so many of us are like, "Oh, sucking a dick. I don't know. That's only freaks do that." Like, really? That's not even the tip of all the thing. Like, the tip, no pun intended, but pun intended, of all the
But
things that are part of your sexual possibilities if you were just open to it. And I'll ask you this: do you ever, with your classes, do some exploration around the affect, around the emotions, and around the hesitations that people have, and do you have any like insight into how people process their emotions around sex, and what are some of the things you found in terms of what people say about their hesitation to really go deeper?
a lot of it is rooted in kind of what you're saying, when we were talking about respectability politics, but more so how it shows up generationally. So, like the
Mm-hmm.
generational conversations. So, last semester, it was hard. I'm just going to be honest because I flipped from being super concerned about my students' safety, and they were like, because, we transitioned due to COVID in the middle of the semester. So, I already had that rapport, and they were like still eager to learn, to now I'm getting a new group of students who, like, are eager to learn but are pandemic fatigued and kind of like, why can't we,
Mm.
be face to face? And I'm thinking, well, your classmate is immune compromised and I'm a little bit scared myself. So
Okay.
I'll
How
just
about
keep it
that?
real. But we had a conversation because it was like, okay, let's try to, talk about chapter content and what's going on in the world. And we had a conversation about WAP. And
Mm.
so when we were talking about, like how do you perceive the song? Have you talked to any of your elders, like your aunties or uncles, or and in particular, there were this day on the attendance there were all the black femmes.
Mm-hmm.
So we kind of talked about it from like generational, like your auntie, your mama, your grandma, and so some people's like, oh my god, my mom heard that and was just like, what is that you're listening to? And then they had a conversation about it. So it's like people taking advantage of those teachable moments, but the
Mm.
feeling of fear that the mom had that her daughter was having sex
Mm-hmm.
and could be, exposing herself to potential harm, whether it was disease or emotional harm or, some kind of physical harm.
Mm-hmm.
But also, it was the emotion for this one mom that was, wait, you are not my little baby anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was that song was that moment for that mom to express that you're not my little girl anymore. Like you're a woman just like me, and that's kind of scary too. And I was like,
Yeah.
I can't believe y'all are having these conversations.
Yeah.
And then another student sharing that, her mom was like, yeah, girl, like, listening to it. And
Yes.
she's kind of like, wait, mom, no, 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 no. Like,
Yeah.
yeah,
But I love
so
that.
yeah, it was a range of feelings and thoughts. And so, when we were talking about how they felt about it, some people felt like it made them feel empowered. Emotionally, they were happy about it. Some people felt like not sad per se, but they thought about other people. And like, if you think about a WAP, does everybody have WAP? Does everybody even call it WAP? Like they were thinking about maybe the inclusiveness of it, or was it, causing potential harm for
Mm-hmm.
other people? And it was just a really good conversation. So yeah, we do try to talk about feelings around certain aspects of their sexuality, and that just happened to be the conversation that it kind of came up in
Yeah.
last
Yeah.
semester.
I love this present generation and how they just really go to the wall in terms of like making things intersectional and being like, so listen, let's talk about these WAPs. And what like
Right.
I love that. And I love you bringing in the generational conversation because I think that is absolutely a matter of race and something to think about with respect to Black culture. Because a lot of
Mm-hmm.
our hesitations may be that, yeah, we may have been grown up in like a totally sexually free, cultural experience. I think of growing up at the height of the 90s with like, and just the 90s and thinking about hip hop and all of the amazing sex
Yes.
positivity that was in hip hop, and still having that idea of like, but my mama gonna know and my grandma gone, and, and I don't want to be judged, and having to navigate those two. And so I think acknowledging that, yeah, some of us are restricted because we're still trying to uphold values and ideals of people who are
Mm-hmm.
not us, right? And who,
Right.
are trying to appease people who may not necessarily have been the people we need to be appeasing. And so
Exactly.
I think that's so important. And a big thing, I think, even when we talk about how sex ed can be healing in the future, I'm always a proponent of generational learning and like recognizing, if you're
Mm-hmm.
teaching the young person, if you're teaching the young adult, if you can do that in community, even better. If you can have it where they're bringing the auntie and they're bringing the, grandma, and they're bringing the foster parents and they're bringing the stepdad, like bring it to the table, let's all talk about it together. I think that's a amazing way to do sex ed, period.
And I
So
wish I could start earlier because, like, my mom supports my work now probably more than I felt like she did in the past. Or maybe,
mhm.
I don't know, like, some shift happened. And especially, like, with NC SexCon, once I started that, like, my mama was at every conference, I think, except maybe one.
Yeah.
But, like, now she's wearing my t shirts. I'm like, Ma, you're not a sex
Yes. Oh,
educator,
and
though. Oh,
I
yes, I am.
realize I
And
realize
then
all
she's
mamas
like,
need to know is, are you gonna be all right? Are you gonna make money? You gonna be okay? All right, I'm
uh
riding.
huh.
Whatever it is you're doing, I'm riding
Okay.
with you. Let's go. Let's go. I just need to
Yeah,
know.
she's like, well, you sent so and so that package with those toys. Like, can you send her another one? Like, I'm like, now you got me mailing sex toys. Okay, fine,
Yes.
man.
I love that. But that's
Sex
that's
toys, condoms, and lube.
yes. I love that. I love that. And shouts out to Black moms because I think and all caregivers, right? I think the often I think we take on what I think is a very Eurocentric narrative that you are in, when it comes to sex, you're in this by yourself. And I just don't think that is the case in our community. Like I obviously I do think violence is real. I do think harm and phobia is real. And I also think that a lot of that phobia is less about being uncomfortable with what you're doing and more discomfort around, what does that mean for your safety? What does that mean for
Right.
your security? Like I am uncomfortable because you're my baby, or you're my family member, and I care about you, and maybe I have a warped perception of what care means. And so my warped perception is that you're only going to be safe if you are, practicing heterosexuality in a cisgender Christian blah 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 relationship.
Yeah.
But it's still coming from this place of that connection that you said, wanting to be connected, and just needing to learn that ain't it, chief. That connection, that ain't how you achieve connection, right? So
Right.
I
Right.
appreciate you bringing all of that up. So you brought up COVID, which was an excellent segue into the questions I wanted to ask you about the vaccine. Well, I think we can start talking about sex and COVID generally, right? And thinking about COVID's effects on sexuality, and maybe some of the sexual choices you feel like people are making, or they may need to think about during this time. But then also thinking about the vaccine, and specifically the vaccine and Black folks, and your thoughts around maybe the folks who are like, I ain't taking that. And maybe even some of the pressure that folks want to put on Black folks to be like, well, why aren't you taking it? We want to make sure you take it
Right.
first.
Right. Right.
Right. So any of that you want to jump into?
Well, I think the first thing that came to my mind, and I did it, I was like, ooh, I am guilty, with COVID, is like, the stigma around it. Like, so when you think about, because of that whole prevention is around HIV and sexually transmitted infections, like, well, someone called and was like, oh, well, so and such tested positive for COVID. We're like, how'd they get it? Like, how did they get it? Was the first thing, not like, why is that any of my concern or business? And I know how it's transmitted, and there are a million things that could have happened to that individual, none of which are my business.
Right.
So it was that whole thing, because I think that's how we feel when someone says they have an STI, if someone says they have HIV, or become pregnant. Like, well, they know how they got pregnant, but they want to know who was,
what was you doing
that impregnated.
Why was
right.
you doing what you're supposed to be doing, right? Because the assumption is
Exactly.
if you have these things, you were not doing what you were supposed to be doing, whatever
To
that
do.
is. Yeah.
But I think it also shines a light on. I knew this as a disease intervention specialist, and I knew that you had to be really good at that job in order to get information. But that folks are still, because of that stigma I just laid out, they're very protective about what they say. So in contact tracing with HIV, and in North Carolina we do syphilis, you're asking people who might they expose, or who might have exposed them through sex, needle sharing, or any of the other behaviors. With COVID, you're doing the same thing, as more so where have you been and who have you been around, because it's more so about letting them know that they've been exposed, just in case they have it. And I know personally some Black folks who are just like, nah, I'm good. And when the contact tracers reached out to them, they withheld some names, which is very much similar to what would happen in the other case. And I wondered why. What was it still rooted in that stigma of like, I did something wrong, or I'm going to be mad or endangered because I might have exposed you, but you didn't do it intentionally. It's still like there's not that intention behind it.
Yeah.
So I think there's still a lot of stigma about disclosing your whereabouts and your whoabouts, because you're putting yourself out there, even though you have in some ways a protection to release these names and information.
Yeah.
And then the other piece of it is that with the vaccine, I'm gonna be honest. I work for Health and Human Services right now. I work at a university. I have my own issues that I'm working through about the vaccine. I know that science works. I believe in science. I also know that people put a lot of Black folks in particular, like we would take a Tylenol any 5 minutes.
Look.
Something was hurting, somebody would give you a Tylenol.
You better take this ginger ale and sit down.
Right, like anything. But when you think about the long term effects, you never know what's going to happen. It's almost like the pros outweigh the unknown cons at the moment in time. Like, you do wish you had more information about the vaccine, but you don't.
Yeah.
Just like we didn't have the information about Tylenol. I think it was Tylenol, I feel like, that was causing like some heightened risk of cancer or some even with liver back in the day. But people still were like, no, it's Tylenol. I trust Tylenol. I really don't know everything that's in Tylenol. I heard Chris Rock say that as the example, so I don't want people to think that he stole it from me. I stole it from him. But there is this idea of like, I don't know what's in a lot of things that I put in my body,
Right.
but I trust that it's safe.
Right.
So I have shifted my thinking to be, I do believe in science, and I have some reason to trust it, but I also have reason not to.
Yeah.
So it's normal for me to have this fear, and I shouldn't have to convince you. If you don't want to take the vaccine, in this particular case, I feel like you shouldn't have to be made to take it.
Yeah.
It's your choice.
Yeah. I appreciate you saying that, because I think a lot of folks are probably, we haven't gotten to the height of that pressure, but I think we are going to as a society once it's clear that we do have a vaccine that's like, oh no, this works and it works for this amount of time. Like, there's going to be this pressure point for a lot of folks, but especially Black folks, of like, I don't know that I even want this. I don't even know that this is something that I want to actively choose, because I am feeling like I don't want to trust this. And this pressure of like, but you need to, and if you don't, there's something wrong with you, and you're being, it's going to be the focus on your stubbornness and not validating. I love that you said that your wavering is normal, that your vacillation is normal, and because I think having folks who be willing to normalize that and be able to say and validate, like, I get why you as a Black person would not want this, and if you don't want it, I'm not going to guilt you, I'm not going to pressure you, I'm not going to take away your resources that you are already may already be compromised in your access to, because you have this healthy skepticism about this thing given the history. I also appreciate what you said about science and the fact that, yeah, there's a lot of stuff that we take that we do not be thinking about what's in it and be like, oh yeah, do you have that same amount of energy for the cheese puffs you was eating last weekend? Like, do you have that same amount of energy for the maxi pads that you put on your body? Because it's a whole lot of stuff that we have normalized that it's okay for us to use that got just as much, if not more, stuff in it that can be harmful to the body. And so I think there's also that piece that can be brought into the table to say, don't make it where you are somehow lifting yourself up as a form of righteousness to be like, no, I'm above the COVID vaccine. Like, don't do that either. So I appreciate you bringing up that complexity. I do want to go back to what you were saying though about contact tracing and the ways that people withhold names, because in this moment a light bulb went off for me about the intersection between I was thinking about sexual behavior and COVID, contracting COVID, but thinking about the parallel process that I don't think I had thought about between, the reluctance to give up certain names for STI tracing and the reluctance to give up COVID names, right? Like, thinking about, oh yeah, if I'm still experiencing the stigma around partners and who I can have sex with and who would be deemed non-respectable, I may still feel like, oh, I don't know that I can tell you that I was with these folks and this experience, because then questions about my sexuality or my sexual behavior are going to come to the fore, and it's going to be less about my health and more about the moral judgment of what I've been doing. On top of, like, I think about that too. Harakuti, who's a professor out of Black sexuality professor out of Goddard College, at the very height of the quarantine, he talked about the fact that, we are, as humans, but I think especially Black folks, we're naturally social people, right? Like, we love to be in community. We love to hang out with each other. So this idea of quarantine, because that's the best thing.
Struggle.
Right. Like, and I think in theory, yes, we want to keep each other safe. We want to be safe. And also, like, that can only go so long, particularly in a country where it's so clear that there's no plan. Like, we don't know how long we're going to keep y'all here by yourselves, but you need to be by yourselves. Right. That it follows, especially for Black folks, that, like, listen, we got about 5 months, but 4th of July coming up and my birthday coming up, and, and so I think at the same time, I get those who have been quote unquote following directions. I get their anger about this. I get their frustration about this. I also understand the people who are like, listen, I cannot let this inept, let this inept process run my life, because
Exactly.
my lively, especially if you live alone, especially if you're someone who's like, I don't have built-in family that I can just plug into. I'm living here by myself. I have desires. I have skin hunger. I have things that I want to have
Right.
fulfilled. I see how that pushes people to be like, you know what? F these rules until y'all
Well,
figure
and
out
I,
something
I
else.
had a conversation with someone who, beyond just like the sexual and social desires, it is survival. We were talking about an individual who actually tested positive, wasn't like severely ill, but was ill, but had no one to help,
Mm,
no one to bring food.
yeah, that's a
And
good
so
point.
this person was going out getting food
Yeah,
and getting stuff that they needed. And so on one end, you're like, why would you do that? But it's like, you didn't have anybody.
yeah.
Like, they didn't have
How was I gonna
anybody that
eat?
they could rely on.
Yeah, that's a
Right.
great point. That's a great point, because I think too, I think it's easy in any case to make assumptions about like how easy we think it is for someone to do something that seems simple, right? Just stay in the house. Why can't you just stay in the house? But it's like, if I live alone and I am sick and I need to eat, what am I doing? Am I just gonna sit here and starve, or like, how does
Right.
that work? Are you going to bring me food? Are you going to call
Right.
me? Are you going to Zoom with me and keep me company and keep me from going delirious about the fear that I have about what's going on in my body, right? So I think all of these things, and I appreciate, as someone specifically in public health, that you are exploring the nuances and helping people see the nuances, because I think sometimes that can get lost in
Right.
the what you said earlier. I think it was sterilized, the way that sex ed even gets taught from these sterilized ideas of,
Mm-hmm.
if you just do this, that, and that, and it's like, that ain't even in context. That don't even make sense.
It
That ain't even
doesn't.
how that
It
would work in context. But you're saying, just do
doesn't.
this, right?
Right.
So,
And repeating it and not even believing it yourself.
right,
Like,
you just like, I'm gonna just do it because it's my job, but y'all do what
yep.
y'all gonna do. So real quickly, Tanya, you mentioned NC SexCon and that work that you do. Talk a little bit more about what was your, for the regular people too, like, because I know NC SexCon is mostly for practitioners, but regular folks can come to it as well. How does that work?
Oh yeah, I came to it because like I have had several jobs. I'll just put that out there. But I've worked in like the different pockets of sexuality and public health, and just like I was saying, we're like, why aren't the folks who work in with men who have sex with men on HIV prevention at this sexuality conference, because they could probably pour into some folks and learn some things themselves. And I just realized that everything was so segmented, in particular in our state. Like there would be an adolescent pregnancy prevention conference and intimate partner violence conference, or maybe HIV prevent. Like everything was like beep beep beep, but there was never like this crossover. And some of the national conferences were a little expensive,
Listen,
and you had to travel to go to. So I was like, you know what? What if I bring well, also the sorry, my partner is
all
making
good.
noise. Is that terrible?
It's all good.
I don't know what to do.
We'll cut it. Keep talking. We'll cut it all out. So,
Okay, but the whole thing around voices not being, you submit a proposal, you get denied, or you don't, no one reached out to you because they know you're doing fabulous work, but they didn't even ask you to be a part of their conference. They got somebody from whereverville all the way to talk about some of the very thing you're doing right here in the state. So I wanted to be able to bring some of those national voices to North Carolina, uplift some of the local voices who are doing great work, and also encourage people to explore across disciplines. And so that's how it came to be. But even in that, some of the work in the community projects, community participatory, I always say it, community-based participatory research. We had, folks who are living in different communities, like in Durham, North Carolina. We were like, well, we're trying to help you be peer educators. You need to come to this conference too. If you're a student or whoever, it was like, if you had an interest in anything sexual related, you could come to this conference. And we didn't want price, or money to be an object. So we offered scholarships. We partnered with as many people as we could to support those scholarships, and raise enough money to try to do that, because we wanted everybody to have an overall experience. And I think it worked. Like, I feel like I don't know which conference is the best because I feel like they were all good in all different ways. You know, like from the connections that people made, from the keynote speakers and the conversations that people had. I think well, it wasn't last year, 2019 was when we were like, okay, let's broaden the scope a little bit more because, you know, it is North Carolina. We didn't know how people were going to take some of the kink conversations and talking about sex toys like fully open. But Goody did a workshop called the Toy Story.
Yes.
And it was jam packed. Like, okay,
Awesome.
I see y'all.
Yes, yes.
You know,
Shouts out to Goody
yeah.
Howard, who's been on the show at this point. So, yes, love that, love that. And I love that, again, what you said about connection. There's this idea of community can be here. The educators can be here, and the regular folks who just want to learn and be in space can be here. And I think that's so important because it pushes back against what I feel like has been the tradition in our profession of kind of being elitist and being like, oh, well, this is just for, you know, folks who have this particular training and have this particular background and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, no, we all get in here. We all gonna talk and we all gonna learn because anyone has the capacity to learn. So let me ask you, so you talked about kind of what you felt like Black folks we need to work on in terms of not yucking other people's yum. Let's say there's someone who's listening who's like, okay, Tanya, I feel you. Like, I get that. And I don't know how to do that. Like, where do I begin? What do I, like, how do I do that? Or I get it, but you know, all my friends or my family, they just don't get that. And I'm not sure how to facilitate or push those discussions. What advice would you have for them?
I think you get to it's almost like say a word, like offer up. You know what? Maybe there are other things. You know, I find myself saying, well, you know, some people like that, and it becomes a debate. And I'm like, you know, it is not here. I don't have the energy to argue because you're gonna think what you think, and then other people want to know a little bit more. And it's not necessarily about you exposing anything about yourself and your likes. It's just helping people center the conversation around being open, you know,
Yeah.
and not open to like I have to do it, but just open to realize people do a whole lot of things that you don't do.
Yeah.
And really like it.
And that's
there's
okay.
some things, and it's okay. That's what I love about it is that I think you can open up the door by just saying, well, you know, some people do this and some people do that. I try, Dr. G, not to get into these Facebook battles, but like depending on my emotional state of the day, I might go in. And I just remember someone, I want to say it was about Niecy Nash and you know, getting married. And someone was saying something very heteronormative in my mind. I think homophobic, but you've heard it like someone saying strictly, you know what, right? And I was like, well, you know, sexuality is fluid, and I'm pretty sure, never saying that this person about their identity, but I was like, sexuality is fluid, and the person that you were at 20 is not who I think you are at this day. Like, all the things about our sexuality changes. No, they don't. And I was just like, back and forth. And I was like I said. And then I realized, I was like, Tanya, why are you putting this energy? I knew I was misdirecting some anger that I had about something else, but also I was just like, I put a lot of energy into having this conversation with this individual, and clearly their mindset.
Well, I think it's beautiful though that you at least said what needed to be said, right? The reality that sexuality is fluid, but also that Niecy Nash could have very well been queer her whole life. Like, she's likely been queer her whole life, and she just happens to be coming out in this particular relationship. Like, even if someone who's bi, someone who's queer, they don't necessarily have to be poly. They don't necessarily have to have a man and a woman at the same time for you to understand their bisexuality. They could have, in fact, have just been bisexual their whole lives, had public relationships with men, and now are showing, hey, now I'm in this public relationship with a woman. All of that can be true. And none of it is your business.
Right. And that's why I was like, why are we arguing? What's wrong with you?
Yeah. And I think too, I guess this was part of the question I could have asked you as well, is I think about folks who are like, well, what will the children say? And what will the children think? You know, we have to set an example for children. And I think it's really important for me that we continue to push these conversations, because the reality, one, I think this generation is starting to teach us more to be like, I don't care what you think. This is what we know to be true, like, about how all of this works. But also just accepting, like, the goal, I think of raising healthy sexual beings as children, and Melissa Carnegie and I had this conversation during the episode I had with her, that a lot of it is less about, I'm going to give you this information and I'm going to train you to think about this in this way, versus increasing their capacity to think and decide for themselves. And I think one of the things we talked about was, as Black adults, as Black elders, we sometimes get into this rigid thinking of, well, my child, this is my child, so they need to think about things the way I think about it. They need to do what I say do. And the reality is that, one, did that work for us? Like, how many things have we been taught that we grew up and we're like, actually, I do differently, right? And or like, I knew that was some bull when I first heard it. And then,
I just didn't have the guts. I didn't want to go into it.
Right. And then, two, of the things that we may have taken on, how is that serving us, right? So the idea, for example, that, I'm not going to get too deep in this, but even just something as simple as, you only have sex until you get married. You don't have sex until you get married. It's like, okay, but I haven't been proposed to and I'm 42. So how does that work?
What am I supposed to do?
How does that work? Exactly. Right. So having that, I think, is really important, that the importance of teaching young people less about the content and more about how to approach their sexuality from a place of developing mastery, and not do this because I said so. And that be it. So I think that.
And how liberating is that for young people? Like,
exactly.
When I look at them, when I do engage with some of my students in class, I'm like, man, I wish I'd been half the person you are now back then.
Come on.
I mean,
really, like, how much freer? Like, I think of various parts of my identity that I only lead into within the past, maybe even like 5, 6, 7 years, where it was like, damn it, where was this in my 20s? Like, where was this? So I definitely agree with you. So I have one formal question before I get into my rapid fire questions. If you would, I'd like you to share what you feel like it means for you to be a Black sexuality educator in this moment in time. Thinking about where we are as a country, where we are as a society, what you feel like either your purpose or your role is, or your significance.
Wow. I wasn't ready for that one. But I think, like, the word that comes to mind is like warrior activist. I feel like in this moment in time, like, it's my responsibility and opportunity to have deep conversations about sexuality, to keep teaching, but teaching from a context of historical perspective. A lot of people are like, well, I don't understand why this law's like that, or why are people like that? And it's kind of like, well, let's just go back.
Right.
Let's look at some of the laws, the policies. Let's look at some of the ways in which people's good intentions cause so much harm, and we're still undoing it today, and that it still shows up today. I feel like, it's that colliding of understanding equity from that public health perspective. When you said, like, public health, racism is a public health crisis. I feel like racism is a sexuality crisis as well. Like, it's all entangled together. And so my role seems now to be like a warrior activist. Like, I need to continue teaching, but I need to use an activist lens to make people understand why it's important to teach what and how I'm teaching it, and that I'm the teacher.
Yes.
That it's important for me to remain in the education space as a Black woman.
Yes. I love that. I love that so much. So powerful. Thank you so much for your presence. All right. You ready for my rapid fire questions?
Let me take a sip.
Okay.
Literally sipping tea. Okay.
Yes. Okay, so these are just 5 sentence stems that I have that are just rapid fire, and you answer with the first thing that comes to your mind, okay?
Okay.
All right. Sexiness is?
Bodies.
Amen. I feel like that's a very Taurus thing for you to say. For those listening, Tanya is a Taurus, and we're friends. That's how I know that. So it's funny. I love it. The sexiest thing about Blackness and or Black people is?
Their spirit.
I love that. Yeah. My go-to for feeling sexy is?
Currently, And I'll show you. I don't know why. Lip gloss.
Yes. It be
Like
popping,
people
right?
have all these. This should be office supplies, but it's literally lip glosses on my desk.
I love that. I love that. It's like, especially now with all these Zooms, it's like, listen, let me get myself together.
Right.
I'm not going to lie. I am a little crusty this morning as I sat down, but we were already running late. But as I sat down, I was like, damn it, where is my lip balm? It's important.
Yeah.
All right. Sexual freedom for Black folk is achieved when
We are able to live our free whole selves.
Yes. Amen. Amen. Finally, when I'm done being on this podcast, I will
take a nap.
Amen. Amen. I affirm. I affirm and validate
I didn't want to
that.
tell it. I was looking dead at my bed and I'm like, I'm totally taking a nap.
Yes. I love that. I love that. Thank you so much, Tanya, for being on this show with me. I am so grateful that you agreed to come, and I feel like this conversation was amazing. There's so many jewels in this. I cannot imagine that folks leave this conversation without just a bunch of different things to think about and percolate with and move on. There will be, in the show notes, y'all can find that there will be references to everything that Tanya raised, all autobiographies and different links that you can explore to get into the thoughts that she brought up. Tanya, really quickly, can you share where folks can find you on social media?
Absolutely, on Instagram. Hopefully they won't close our accounts.
Look.
But it is the Tanya Bass, TheTanyambass, and my website is just www.tanyambass.com.
Love it, love it, love it. Thank you again for being here,
Thanks
Tanya.
for having me.
You've been listening to T.S.O.B. with Dr. G, produced by Dr. Tracy Q. Gilbert of Tempe, Anaya. To keep up with all things T.S.O.B., follow us on social media at T.S.O.B. the podcast, which you can find on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. For past episodes of the show, visit tsobpodcast.com or subscribe to the show either on YouTube or anywhere else you listen to podcasts. Now, don't forget that you've got homework for this episode. To find the downloadable worksheet for this or any other episode of the show, head on over again to tsobpodcast.com, where you'll find it and any other important information from the show notes. And finally, do you have any questions or thoughts to share? Sound off by email at mailbox@tsobpodcast.com. Again, this was T.S.O.B., the sex ed of Black folk. Thank you for listening. Talk again soon.